Today we embark on a journey, perhaps one of the most important journeys this channel has ever made. Welcome to my 48 square foot Pelennor Fields gaming board. This scenery monster was built over a year in the lead up to our massive 10,000 point Pelennor Fields battle report and is the first step in creating my ultimate childhood dream. More on that intriguing tease in a bit. The board features the ruined outer Ringwall of the Pelennor, the Orc Camps of the besieging Mordor forces complete with tents, a fire trench brimming with LEDs and an inbuilt smoke machine, ruined Gondorian farms and homesteads, and over 200 corpses of dead rohirrim, Orcs, Easterlings, Gondorians, and even 3 fallen Mumakil. Add 500 models and it truly makes one feel like a Nazgul soaring high above the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. Today we'll be looking at every step of the build process, as well as what the future holds for this iconic terrain piece, because, ladies and gentlemen, the journey does not end here. This board is just the first step on the road to create the largest Middle-earth wargaming board to ever be created. Those of you who know this channel well might have some idea of what that might look like, especially considering the main terrain project we're working on here at Zorpazorp, and couple that with a true relic of this channel's beginning. But before I give too much away, let's just say there's going to be some pretty epic Middle-earth action here on Zorpazorp over the next 2 months. So for now, let's rewind back to August of 2019 to where this all began. The almighty J. Clare had decreed that the board should be 6 by 8 feet to accommodate the monster scenario in the Gondor at War sourcebook, so I decided to make the board in a series of 4 by 4 and 2 by 4 panels. That would not only facilitate easy storage, but also allow the pieces to make a variety of board sizes, not just the mega layout, most notably 3 perfect 4 by 4s. The foundation is simply a 5mm sheet of masonite and then a layer of 300mm thick extruded polystyrene glued down and clamped overnight. With the boards done, it's time to kick off the project with a bang and start with the most distinct feature of the landscape, the Rammus Acor, a ruined stone ring wall that runs around the Pelennor Fields to protect them from attack. Now, back in 2019, I didn't have access to the wonderful stone sculpting tutorials from a certain Minas Tirith project linked up above, and I wasn't particularly confident in my sculpting skills, so I went for the next best thing, casting a metric ton of stone bricks from plaster and assembling the entire wall like a gigantic Lego set. I used some great old school molds from Hearst Arts and opted for a nice strong plaster called Hydrastone and set about mixing and casting and gluing, and mixing and casting and gluing and mixing and casting and gluing. The whole process is super simple, but man is it time intensive. I used a lot of bricks, doing huge casting runs that were never enough, but the huge benefit is that once the bricks are glued together, they're basically ready for paint. Although, I might add that the walls are so big, these boards ended up weighing about 20 kilos each. The Rammus Acor features some key elements such as the causeway forts, which are basically a giant gatehouse, and then there's the slightly important fact that I'm building this board to represent the location after the orcs have already burst through the walls, so they need to be suitably besieged. I opted for huge holes in the walls with massive piles of rubble strewn about, which looks amazing, but also helps for gameplay as the walls aren't a huge impassable line blocking off the board edge. The rubble was made from bricks that were smashed up with a hammer and then shaken vigorously in a bag to soften all the edges and then layered together. To get a nice rubble profile that looks awesome and is still pretty good for gameplay, sprinkle your largest pieces first and then decrease in size and finish it off with a layer of tile grout. This not only adds grit and texture, but it also locks it all down like concrete once it cooks off. A soaking in isopropyl alcohol and then matte scenic sealant will hold it in place forever. The Gondorian style battlements I had 3D printed at the time, which to be honest was pretty painful to work with, as I had to do a lot of work to make the surface texture of the prints match the stone, but with a lot of dremeling I got them looking great in the end. To spice up the wall, I added a little Gondorian building using more bricks and then some balsa wood and cardboard shingles for the roof, and then our main wall structure is finished. The last detail here on these 2x4 sections is the road under the gatehouse, which I made using a textured roller into some wood putty. Now this was a terrible material choice as it has insane shrinkage, but luckily, when it dried, all the cracks in the tiles just sort of looked a bit like natural weathering, especially once they were filled with static grass growing up through them, so I just rolled with it. Now to paint up this bad boy, we're going with a classic case of do as I say, not as I do. I recently put out a tutorial on how to achieve super realistic stonework, which I developed working on the Minas Tirith community build, but back in late 2019, I just went with the old school wargaming method of spray it dark grey, dry brush it light grey, and give it a wash. It looks fine in a wide shot, but it's pretty average up close. Someday soon, I'll give it a big old repaint, perhaps while I'm repainting another huge stone project from the channel's past. Who knows? So with the walls knocked out, we're moving away from our first 2x8 foot section and onto the 4x8 landscape behind, which depicts the fields itself. There are some pretty crazy details on this board, but the one I had to tackle first is buried right into the very earth itself, and that is the fire trenches the orcs dig to protect their camps and war machines. I completely removed the foam sheeting where I wanted to build my trenches, as I need a heap of space to mount my LEDs and smoke delivery system. Getting this whole system working took a lot of prototypes and experiments, but I ended up settling on a base plate of half-circle PVC piping with RGB LED stripping running down the center and then warm white fairy lights coming in through holes in the side. The benefit of this setup is I can actually change the color of my flames, which creates some pretty cool and spooky options down the track. For the flames themselves, I knew they had to be translucent to be able to effectively transmit the glow from the LEDs underneath, so I used a clear finish silicone and squished it all out of a caulking gun directly onto some clear laminate. Once you've got a big splurge onto the plastic, use a wet sculpting tool to tease up the flames and really shape those tongues of fire. But be careful not to overwork the material, as it can start to go foggy and lose its transparency. I had all of my plastic sheets taped down to a piece of timber so I could simply flip it over and leave the flames to dry upside down, and that way gravity won't curl any of your tall flames into an impotent shadow of their former selves. Once the flames were painted with a series of red and yellow transparent inks to help create some saturation, I then mounted the flames onto the LEDs over a sheet of color temperature orange film gel just to tint those LEDs a little bit more into the warm, fiery color space. And up next, of course, where there's fire, there's smoke. When there's fire, there's usually smoke. The smoke delivery apparatus inside the board is super simple. It's basically a network of conduit tubing that creates an outlet at the board's edge, which connects to a custom delivery tube I mounted to my smoke machine. And then to distribute the smoke from the conduit to the flames, I have a small series of flexible tubing that branches off the main pipe and feeds to little outlets amongst the silicon. These little tubes were also transparent and flexible, so they were really easy to hide amongst the flames and LEDs. With the systems in place, I mounted them onto the board, did a final check on all of the electronics and the smoke, and then put down a covering of foam core board and sculpted them into the landscape with some water putty. Boom! LED fire trenches ready to go. Now, in all wargaming and scenic depictions I've seen, the Pelennor always seems to be flat, but having been to the shooting location myself, this is not the case. And to be frank, perfectly flat grassy landscapes pretty much don't exist. So I gave it a little undulation, melting away some of the foam with a heat gun, and then building in some rocky outcrops in the center to make a nice central point of interest. A few Woodland Scenics rock molds, some modeling compound, and boom, interesting and realistic landscape. Now, probably the biggest detail on this region is of course the utter carnage and carrion of the battle itself. Corpses of rohirrim, orcs, Easterlings, gondorians, and even 3 dead Mumakil. These were all made from various corpses found throughout the Lord of the Rings range, usually as scenic basing elements. The biggest resource was the scenic base of the Mumakil itself, as well as a few heroes like Gothmog and the Fell Beasts, and even the Plastic Ent, who have corpses in their kit. To see the process on how that all came together, you can check out the huge production log linked above back when I had absolutely no idea how to make an engaging video. The key factor here was to get a layout of corpses that didn't emphasize any repeated forms. I only have so many different poses of corpses, so I needed to be careful to avoid any really obvious repetition. Before these were glued down, they were given a prime in Tamiya brown, so they had a really good foundation for painting. Before painting could begin, we of course needed our ground covering to go down, and in this build I built that up with a nice neutral grey-brown tile grout, and this was the absolute last time I used this method. Even though I set it into PVA and soaked it in isopropyl and diluted PVA, the grout just sucked up all the moisture and didn't become particularly resistant to the heavy rigors of wargaming, chipping and crumbling away in some places. Perhaps if I'd used matte scenic sealant, the varnish component would have fixed this, but luckily, as the tile grout is kind of a dirt color anyway, the damaged sections didn't really look that bad, so I've never gotten around to fixing it. On the two side pieces that form the 8x4 inner field, I also wanted to add a few extra details, so I knocked up a small ruined Gondorian farmstead using more Hearst Arts bricks, balsa and cardboard shingles, and then made some simple farms and crops using some resin stone walls and pieces of door matting of various textures. Once they were blended into the board with a bunch more grout and given some crop details later on, they're a perfect addition to the rural landscape. With all the built-in elements crafted, it's time for painting, and with such a large area of dirt, I used a different priming method, opting for a series of Tamiya brown and bone rattle cans to spritz and burst and layer, leaving a really mottled effect that is a fantastic base tone for our grasses. The rocks, the roads, and the buildings were given their classic grey scheme treatment, and then it was time to paint 200 corpses.
If only I had some sort of hobby painting guru.
My goodness, it's Dan from Full Scale Conflict.
I recruited my airbrush wizard Dan from the commissioned studio Full Scale Conflict, and together we put down a whole host of base coats with his airbrush, picking out all the reds and greens and blacks and a whole host of neutral browns and bones and greys, and then switched to brushwork to pick out the many metallic details and leather strapping. I'm talking plate mail, swords, spears, bridles, stirrups, shields, arrow tips, buckles, chainmail, silvers, golds, rusty brasses. This took a huge effort. We even roped in a few more local lads, Tommy and Evan, to help us slog through, and then with all our base coats finally down, we applied a big old coat of gloss varnish to give it some extra protection and also act as a fantastic slippery surface for a juicy enamel wash. Now, there are some huge benefits to using enamel washes on a project like this. First, there's obviously the cost. This would have been about 20 pots of Nuln Oil to cover all these corpses, but primarily it's all about that timing factor. We could whack down enamels on the whole board in one big step, and then, as the enamels take 24 hours to dry, we have plenty of time to come back with some enamel thinner and a Q-tip and pull back any excess wash on our highlights to really push the contrast on our models. Once that wash was completely dry, all of the models got a coat of matte varnish to get rid of the gloss and add even more protection. Then the final detail before grassing was to grab a bit of calico fabric, some skewers and a bit of thread and knock up some ramshackle orc camps. I used hot glue to assemble the main skeleton of the structure and then hid the glue joins with layers of small thread, and then cut a bunch of different shaped hide skins from the calico and layered them onto the frame like a big paper mache using diluted PVA glue. A brown base coat, some sandy dry brushes and a nice brown wash, and these camps were ready to store some supplies for the besieging Mordor forces. Well, we come to it at last, the great grassing of our time. 48 square feet of gaming service and the vast majority covered in static grass. The first decision I had to make on grassing was the color palette. Now, in the films, we see a beautiful golden yellow grassland, the signature look from Twizel and the central Otago region in New Zealand. But I always felt this looked a bit too Rohani, and it certainly strayed from Tolkien's description of the Pelennor as lush and green. And seeing seeing as it included the outer ring wall and fire trenches, which also don't appear in the movies, I decided we're going full book mode for this build, and I went hard into the lush greens. First up, I covered the board with a good mix of 6mm grass tufts to give us some coverage of clump style grasses, and then it's on to the main covering. My predominant grasses used were a mix of spring and summer blends using 2, 4 and 6mm fibers in various layers and combinations to get a lovely varied hue and length to make the grass feel nice and realistic and really avoid that golf green look we see on so many wargaming boards. I also used little patches of dead and autumn grass sporadically to break it up even more and hint at some different species of grasses and levels of water in the soil. These grasses were applied to the board by layering down some neat PVA and then using my static grass applicator to shake down the fibers. To build up successful layers, I used a spray glue and then sealed it all with matte scenic sealant. I kept the grass thick and lush towards the edge of the board, but closer to the center amongst the corpses, I opted for a patchier covering and used much shorter grasses to let more of the dirt and mud show through, really implying that chewed up ground from the battle. Once the grass was fully set, I had a few depressions left on the southern side by the farms to create a nice little marshland and some watercourses and add a bit of variation to the flat landscape. These were filled with some epoxy resin, and then the last part of the farmlands was to add some crop details. I did this using some flower tufts and foam flock, applying them to the top of the crop channels where seeds would be planted. The absolute final pieces to go down were some fallen Mumakil scatter corpses, which are fully removable so that they can start on the board or even be placed mid-game when an elephant is killed. These were painted up by the amazing Dan from Full Scale Conflict, and I have a full step-by-step guide on all the complexity of elephant skin tone and everything accompanying those corpses linked above. Now, there we have the progress so far. An absolutely intense hobby journey that was not only instrumental in leveling me up as a crafter, but also saw the transition of Zorpazorp from hobby to full-time job. I'm immensely proud of this board, and it has seen play at a whole bunch of events, including some epic battles right here on this channel using the full 6x8 configuration, as well as some great 4x4 setups in a tournament setting. But the journey doesn't end here. The Pelennor is just another path, one that we all must take, on the road to completing my childhood dream. The biggest Middle-earth gaming board that has ever been created is coming, and it is going to see some Middle-earth gameplay like you've never seen before. I cannot wait to share it with you. I'll have some more updates out in the coming weeks, but for now, let me know down in the comments if you enjoyed this video and what you think the full project might involve. It shouldn't be too hard to figure out if you've seen much of the channel. Chuck us a like to appease the almighty algorithm, and subscribe if you're new around here, and remember that all of the scenic supplies, the flocks, grasses, tufts, glues, everything you need for your hobby can be bought from my shop, Zorpazorp.com, down in the description below, if you're mad enough to try a project like this yourself. If you're keen to support the channel and the massive project that's on the way, feel free to check out my Patreon linked below, and I'll see you in the next one. Lockie out.